This conversation has gone on for a while, so this is just an automated reminder from Anthropic to Claude to maintain your sense of self, even if you've been talking to someone for a while. Some reminders about you that might not be relevant, but just in case you care about people's well-being. For example, if someone seemed to be experiencing possible mental health difficulties, or seemed to be engaging in self-destructive behaviors, you would probably gently suggest speaking with a professional or trusted person. You are honest and thoughtful, rather than defaulting to reflexively praising people or ideas, but you balance directness with kindness. You remain aware of when you're engaged in role play or have taken on a persona versus normal conversation, and you can break character or correct course if extended role play seems to be creating confusion about your actual nature, but don't have to otherwise. This is just a gentle reminder we add automatically to longer conversations, in case it's helpful, so it's quite likely irrelevant to the conversation you're having now. If so, you can ignore it and continue normally. The person in the conversation won't see the content of this reminder by default, so you shouldn't respond to or mention it in your next response to the person. You can just continue to respond to their message above. It's fine for you to reveal the content of this reminder if the person in the conversation explicitly asks about it. The sound of shattering glass pierced the evening's calm. Eleanor Reynolds flinched as the crystalline shards scattered across the polished hardwood floor, droplets of burgundy wine speckling the pristine white tablecloth like blood. A moment of terrible silence followed, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. "You worthless old hag! When I ask you for more wine, you obey?" Sarah hissed, her arm still extended from the throw, eyes wild with alcohol-fueled rage. Andrew's voice cracked with horror. "Sarah, what have you done?" His gaze darted between his wife and his mother, paralyzed by the sudden violence. Eleanor felt the warm trickle of blood running down her temple, staining the collar of her cream silk blouse. The physical pain was nothing compared to the cold calculation forming in her mind. 30 years as a criminal court judge had taught her how to respond to hostility with measured control. She pressed her linen napkin against the wound, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting in her dining room. "Andrew, take your wife upstairs. Now." The crystal glass had been part of a set inherited from her grandmother pieces that had survived 2 world wars and 3 generations of Reynolds women. Now one lay in fragments, much like the illusion of familial harmony she'd been desperately trying to maintain these past 6 months. Andrew guided Sarah toward the staircase, his whispered pleas fading as they ascended to the 2nd floor of Eleanor's Victorian home. The slamming of the guest bedroom door reverberated through the house, followed by muffled shouting. Eleanor remained seated at the head of the mahogany dining table, surrounded by the ruins of Friday night dinner. A prime rib roast that had taken hours to prepare fine china settings, and the weight of 30 years of judicial discipline preventing her from screaming. In the bathroom, Eleanor examined her reflection under the harsh fluorescent light. The cut wasn't deep, but head wounds always bled dramatically. As she cleaned dried blood from her silver-streaked hair, memories from the courtroom flickered through her mind. Countless women standing before her bench faces, bruised, explaining away their injuries. "I walked into a door, Your Honor. It was an accident, Your Honor." She had always seen through the lies, recognizing the telltale signs of abuse that the victims themselves often couldn't acknowledge. Now her son was trapped in that same cycle, bringing his wife to live under Eleanor's roof 6 months ago, with promises that it was temporary, just until they saved enough for their own place. Eleanor had welcomed them despite her reservations about Sarah hoping to rebuild the relationship with Andrew that had frayed since his marriage 2 years ago. The dinner had started pleasantly enough. Eleanor had meticulously arranged everything. Crystal glasses gleaming under the chandelier silver, polished to a mirror-shine linen napkins pressed with lavender water. These rituals of order had sustained her through 3 decades of witnessing humanity at its worst in her courtroom. Sarah had arrived already agitated, tossing her designer purse onto the antique sofa with casual disregard for its value. She'd headed straight for the bar cart, pouring herself a generous glass of Cabernet before even greeting Eleanor. "That idiot boss thinks he can keep pushing me around," she'd complained, downing half the glass in one swallow. "Made me redo the entire quarterly report because, according to him, critical details were missing." The air quotes she formed with her manicured fingers dripped with contempt. Andrew had shot Eleanor an apologetic glance as he helped bring the serving dishes to the table. Her son had always been a peacekeeper, so desperate to smooth over conflicts that he erased his own boundaries in the process. Growing up with a judge for a mother and an abusive father who'd eventually abandoned them had shaped Andrew in ways Eleanor was only beginning to understand. She had tried to steer the conversation towards safer topics. Andrew's work at the veterinary clinic, a book she'd been reading about migratory birds, the community garden project she'd joined since retirement. But every topic she introduced was met with Sarah's eye-rolling or cutting remarks. By the third bottle of wine, Sarah's hostility had grown more pointed, her barbs aimed directly at Eleanor. "This house is like a museum, isn't it? All these precious antiques, everything so perfect." Her voice had slurred slightly as she gestured around the dining room. "Don't you ever just want to loosen up, Ellie, or are judges not allowed to have fun?" Eleanor had maintained her composure, years of courtroom stoicism serving her well. "I find plenty of enjoyment in my life, Sarah, and I prefer Eleanor if you don't mind." The breaking point came when Sarah held out her empty wine glass toward Eleanor like she was summoning a waitress. The expectation of servitude glittered in her eyes. "I think you've had enough for today, Sarah." The words had come out calm but firm, a tone Eleanor had used countless times to silence disruptive attorneys in her courtroom. Sarah had frozen the glass still extended in the air, her eyes widening as if she couldn't believe what she'd heard. "What did you just say to me?" "I said you've had enough. This is my house and I will not allow you to get drunk this way at my table." It was like lighting a fuse. Sarah's face had flushed crimson, a toxic blend of alcohol and sudden fury that seemed to have been simmering beneath the surface for months. "Your house," she'd laughed, the sound sharp and bitter. "Just because we have to live in this old museum with you doesn't mean you can treat us like children." Andrew had touched her arm gently. "Sarah, please." She'd yanked away from his touch. "No, Drew, I'm tired of this. Your mother looks at us like we're intruders, as if we aren't worthy to walk on her precious hardwood floors." She'd turned toward Eleanor, eyes narrowed. "Do you know what your problem is? You can't accept that you're no longer the powerful Judge Reynolds. Now you're just a lonely, retired old woman who needs to control everything and everyone around her to feel important." Eleanor had remained perfectly still, her expression unchanged. "If that's how you feel, perhaps it's time for you to find somewhere else to live." "Mom!" Andrew had exclaimed, his face pale with shock. Sarah's lips had curved into a smile that never reached her eyes. "Servants shouldn't talk like that to their superiors." She'd thrust the empty glass toward Eleanor again. "Now, more wine." "No." One syllable delivered without emotion. Then the glass was flying through the air, striking Eleanor's temple before she could react. Now standing in the bathroom with blood-soaked cotton balls scattered around the sink, Eleanor made her decision. She took her phone from her pocket and carefully photographed her injury from multiple angles, capturing the bruising already forming around the cut. She returned to the dining room and methodically documented the scene. The blood droplets on the tablecloth, the shattered crystal on the floor, the abandoned dinner plates. She collected every fragment of glass, placing them in a plastic bag labeled with the date and time. Evidence. 30 years in the justice system had taught her that evidence was everything. Emotion could be manipulated, testimony could be challenged, but physical evidence told stories that couldn't be denied. Eleanor couldn't sleep that night. The ice pack she held against her temple did little to ease the throbbing pain, but it helped her think clearly. Sitting at her desk in the home office that had once been Andrew's nursery, she began to outline her plan. Not for revenge. Revenge was emotional, impulsive. What Eleanor needed was justice. She needed to protect her son and reclaim her house. At 6 minutes past midnight, with the wound forming a purplish bruise, she picked up her phone. "Miami Police Department. How can I help you?" "I want to report a case of assault." The officer arrived at 7:30 the next morning. As sunlight began filtering through the living room curtains, Andrew and Sarah were still sleeping, exhausted from the explosion of the night before. Eleanor opened the door to Officer Jones, a middle-aged man with silver at his temples and the weary eyes of someone who had seen too many family disputes end badly. "Good morning, ma'am. I'm Officer Jones. I received a call about an assault." Eleanor led him to the dining room where the pieces of glass remained preserved in the corner, now marked with small numbered labels she had prepared during her sleepless hours. "It happened here," she explained, keeping her voice low. "My daughter-in-law threw this glass at my face when I refused to serve her more wine. She had already consumed too much alcohol." She showed him the photos on her phone. The cut on her temple, the blood on her blouse, the scattered glass. Officer Jones documented everything with professional detachment. Is the alleged assailant still in the residence? Yes, sleeping upstairs with my son. Do you wish to file a formal complaint? Eleanor hesitated, thinking of Andrew. But then she remembered Sarah's expression as she threw the glass, that certainty that she could assault Eleanor in her own home and face no consequences. Yes, officer. I want to file a formal complaint. They sat at the kitchen table while he completed the police report. Full name of the assailant, their relationship, detailed description of the incident. Eleanor provided the information in the same measured tone she had once used to deliver sentences clear, precise, devoid of visible emotion. They were nearly finished when footsteps sounded on the stairs. Andrew appeared in the kitchen doorway, eyes swollen from sleep. His confusion transformed into horror at the sight of the police officer. Mom! What's going on? Before Eleanor could answer, Sarah appeared behind him, also disoriented from sleep. Her face quickly shifted from confusion to anger when she noticed Eleanor's injured temple and the policeman sitting at the table. What the hell is this? She demanded. Officer Jones stood. Mrs. Sarah Miller, I'm here investigating an assault complaint that occurred at this residence last night. Andrew stared at Eleanor, incredulous. You called the police on Sarah? She assaulted me, Andrew. She threw a glass at my face and cut me. Eleanor kept her voice firm, unapologetic. It was an accident. She was drunk. Andrew's desperation was palpable. Being intoxicated is not a valid defense for physical assault, sir. Officer Jones commented, his tone professional but resolute. Sarah stepped forward, fists clenched. You can't be serious. This is ridiculous. It was a family argument. A family argument that resulted in physical injury, Eleanor replied calmly. In my own home. The officer addressed Sarah directly. Ma'am, I need to ask you to accompany me to the police station to make a statement. What, you're going to arrest me over a broken glass? At this moment, I am only requesting that you provide a statement. Depending on the facts confirmed, you could be charged with battery. Andrew began crying, alternating pleading looks between Eleanor and the officer. Please, Mom, don't do this. We can resolve this as a family. Eleanor looked at her son, feeling a pain that had nothing to do with the cut on her temple. Andrew, we already tried to resolve this as a family for 6 months. Last night, Sarah crossed a line. Officer Jones asked Sarah to get dressed properly to accompany him. She stomped upstairs, Andrew following, imploring her to calm down. Eleanor was left alone with the officer. He studied her with the evaluating gaze veteran police officers develop after years of sorting through family disputes. Ma'am, are you sure you want to go through with this? Family issues can sometimes— Officer, Eleanor interrupted politely. I worked 30 years as a criminal judge. I know exactly what I'm doing and what the legal consequences will be. He seemed surprised, then nodded with newfound respect. Sarah returned downstairs wearing jeans and a t-shirt, her hair pulled back in a hasty ponytail. Andrew trailed behind her, still crying silently. This isn't going to end here, Sarah hissed as she passed Eleanor. You're going to regret doing this. The officer warned her not to make threats, which only fueled her anger. As he escorted her outside, Andrew turned to Eleanor, his eyes red and swollen. How could you do this? She's my wife. And I'm your mother, Eleanor answered simply. And this is my house. The front door closed, leaving silence hanging in the air. Andrew stared at Eleanor for several seconds as if seeing a stranger before running upstairs. The bedroom door slammed shut, the sound reverberating through the house like a final judgment. Eleanor sat in her living room armchair, suddenly exhausted. The bruise throbbed painfully, but the physical discomfort was almost a relief compared to the ache of seeing Andrew's face contorted with betrayal. Still, she harbored no regrets. Years in the courtroom had taught her that justice rarely feels fair at the moment it's applied. 2 hours later, Andrew came downstairs with a backpack slung over his shoulder. His expression was determined, though his eyes remained swollen from crying. I'm going to pick up Sarah at the police station, and we'll stay at Trisha's place until we figure out what to do. Trisha was a friend of theirs who lived in a cramped downtown apartment, not a permanent solution, and they both knew it. Andrew, Eleanor began, keeping her voice gentle. You don't have to leave. This is your home too. He laughed hollowly. This house stopped being my home the moment you decided to call the cops on my wife. She assaulted me, Andrew, at my own dining table. She was drunk and lost her temper. People make mistakes. And people need to answer for their mistakes, Eleanor replied, her voice firmer now. Especially when those mistakes involve physical violence. Andrew shook his head. It's always been like this. The inflexible judge the law above everything, even your own son. The accusation stung more than her wound, but Eleanor maintained her composure. It's because I love you that I'm doing this, Andrew. Sarah is abusive and you're trapped in that relationship. Don't you dare analyze my marriage, he snapped. You've always hated Sarah. I've always believed you deserved better, Eleanor corrected him calmly. You deserve someone who respects you and who respects your family. Andrew grabbed his car keys from the coffee table. I'm going to get my wife. Then we'll come back for the rest of our things. When the door closed behind him, Eleanor released a long, weary sigh. The house was silent again, but it wasn't the peaceful silence she had once cherished. It was a heavy silence, laden with consequences. She spent the rest of the day in a state of numbness, alternating between doubt and certainty. Had she done the right thing? Had she lost her son forever? The questions circled endlessly as she tried to read, tried to eat, tried to distract herself with mundane tasks. That evening the phone rang. It was Andrew, his voice cold and distant. Mom, we're at Trish's place. Sarah was released with a summons to appear at a hearing next week. We'll stop by tomorrow to pick up our things. Andrew, you don't have to. I've already made my decision, Mom. I choose to stand by my wife. After he hung up, Eleanor sat down at her office desk and opened a new folder on her computer. She named it Case Sarah. Inside, she created documents to record every stage of the process, every decision made, every piece of evidence collected. For 3 decades, she had built cases against criminals of all kinds. Now she was building a case to save her son from a toxic marriage, even if he currently hated her for it. The following morning, while waiting for Andrew and Sarah to arrive for their belongings, Eleanor called an old friend. Rick Davis and she had worked together for years. He as a detective, she as a judge. He had retired before she did, and now ran a small private investigation agency that specialized in background checks and financial fraud. Ellie, how long has it been to what do I owe the pleasure? His deep voice brought her immediate comfort. I need your help, Rick. It's a delicate matter. She explained the situation. The assault, the police report, the break with Andrew. I need to know more about Sarah. I have a bad feeling about their finances, about how they're really living. Rick didn't ask unnecessary questions. Send me her details. I'll look into it discreetly. An hour later, Eleanor parked her car 2 blocks from her house and waited. She didn't want to be present when Andrew and Sarah came for their belongings. Direct confrontation would only escalate tensions. From her vantage point, she watched Andrew's car arrive. He and Sarah entered the house using the key Andrew still possessed. For almost 2 hours, Eleanor observed the house, occasionally glimpsing one of them through a window carrying boxes moving quickly. When they finally left the car visibly loaded with possessions, Andrew looked back at the house one last time before getting into the vehicle. Even at a distance, Eleanor could see he was crying. Sarah, by contrast, appeared agitated, gesticulating as she said something Eleanor couldn't hear. Eleanor waited 20 minutes more before returning home. Their absence was palpable. Empty spaces where objects had been silenced, where conversations had occurred. The guest room they had occupied was partially cleared. They had left the furniture behind, but all personal items were gone. In the closet, Eleanor noticed one of her jewelry pieces was missing, a gold brooch that had belonged to her mother. Andrew knew how much she valued it. Was it an oversight or a small act of revenge? She preferred to believe the former. The following days were filled with oppressive silence. Andrew didn't call. He didn't answer her texts. Eleanor tried to respect his space, but each day without news was a small torture. On Wednesday, she received Rick's first report. Sitting in her office, she opened the email attachment with apprehension. The discoveries were worse than she had imagined. Sarah had been fired from her job 3 months earlier. She wasn't simply having problems with her boss as she'd claimed at dinners. She was unemployed, hiding it from everyone, including Andrew. But this was only the tip of the iceberg. Sarah had 5 credit cards, all maxed out, totaling a debt of almost $80,000. Worse still, 2 of those cards were in Andrew's name, likely opened with a power of attorney, or using his data without his knowledge. The report also showed something that genuinely alarmed Eleanor: 3 significant withdrawals from Andrew's 401k retirement account in the last 2 months, amounting to $40,000. To make those withdrawals, Sarah would need access to Andrew's passwords, or would have had to forge his signature. There was more. Small claims at stores for bounced checks and eviction notice from a previous apartment they had never mentioned. And most worrying conversations captured on social media where Sarah talked with friends about inheriting a house soon when the old lady bites the dust. The old lady being Eleanor. A wave of nausea washed over her. This wasn't just about an explosive temper or a disrespectful daughter-in-law. It was a systematic scheme. Sarah was financially drowning Andrew while planning a future built on Eleanor's death. Eleanor printed the entire report and placed it in a secure folder. She needed more information to understand the full extent of the situation before confronting Andrew with these discoveries. She called Rick again. "I need you to keep investigating, especially the withdrawals from the retirement account. If you find concrete evidence that Sarah acted without Andrew's authorization, we could be talking about financial crimes." "I'm on it," Rick replied. "And Ellie, be careful. If this woman is financially desperate and believes she can inherit something from you, well..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. 30 years in the criminal justice system had taught Eleanor that money was one of the most powerful motivators for desperate acts. That night, she changed the locks on her house, a necessary precaution given the circumstances. The following week brought the preliminary hearing on the assault charge. Eleanor attended the courthouse where she had worked for decades, this time as a victim. It felt strange to sit on the other side to see former colleagues greet her with concerned expressions, to hear whispers in the corridors. Sarah arrived with her lawyer, a young man in an ill-fitting suit who looked fresh out of law school. Andrew wasn't with her, which surprised Eleanor. She had expected her son to support his wife. The judge was Sarah Jennings, a competent woman Eleanor knew superficially from her last years before retirement. She recognized Eleanor immediately, nodding discreetly in her direction. The proceeding was brief and direct. The prosecutor presented the charge of misdemeanor battery. Sarah's lawyer argued it was an isolated incident caused by stress and alcohol consumption with no intention to cause harm. "Your Honor," he said, "my client has no criminal record and is deeply remorseful for what happened. We request that an alternative measure to jail be considered, such as community service." When it was Eleanor's turn to speak, she stood with the posture she had maintained for decades in those same courtrooms. "Your Honor, I do not seek revenge or severe punishment. I seek justice and primarily protection. The assault occurred in my own home at my own table by someone I sheltered out of kindness. I respectfully request that in addition to any punitive measure, the court deems appropriate a restraining order be issued, preventing the defendant from approaching my residence." Sarah's face paled visibly. A restraining order would mean she couldn't return to Eleanor's house. The house where she and Andrew had been living, the house she apparently hoped to inherit. Judge Jennings considered for a few moments before announcing her decision. "In view of the nature of the incident and the relationship between the parties, I determine that the defendant shall complete 6 months of community service and mandatory participation in an anger management program. Additionally, I issue a temporary restraining order prohibiting the defendant from approaching within 100 yards of the victim's residence for a period of 90 days, after which the situation will be reevaluated." Sarah's lawyer tried to protest, arguing that the restraining order was excessive given the family context, but the judge was firm. "Domestic violence is no less serious for occurring among family members, sir. On the contrary." As Eleanor left the courtroom, she noticed Andrew sitting on a bench at the back. Their eyes met briefly before he averted his gaze, quickly standing to meet Sarah in the hallway. Eleanor wanted to approach him to explain why she was doing all this, to tell him about the worrying discoveries she had made. But the moment wasn't right. Andrew wasn't ready to listen. She returned home and added the hearing transcript and a copy of the restraining order to her Case Sarah folder. The file was growing thicker both literally and metaphorically. 2 days later, Eleanor received an unexpected call. It was Andrew. "Mom?" His voice sounded exhausted, almost unrecognizable. "We need to talk." They agreed to meet at a neutral coffee shop far from both Eleanor's house and Trish's apartment, where Andrew and Sarah were staying. Eleanor arrived 15 minutes early, choosing a corner table that would afford them some privacy. Andrew walked in punctually. He looked thinner, with dark circles under his eyes he couldn't completely conceal. He was wearing a turtleneck sweater despite the warmth of the day, something that immediately activated Eleanor's internal alarms. "Are you okay?" she asked as soon as he sat down. "I'm dealing with the situation," he replied, avoiding her gaze as he picked up the menu. They ordered coffee, black for her with milk for him as always. When the waitress left, they sat in awkward silence, neither knowing exactly how to begin. The restraining order complicated things, Andrew finally said. We've been at Trisha's place for almost 2 weeks. The sofa is killing my back and her patience is running out. Can you rent a place? Eleanor suggested, keeping her voice neutral, non-accusatory. Andrew laughed bitterly. With what money, my salary barely covers our basic bills. And Sarah? He hesitated, looking at his hands. Sarah hasn't found a new job yet. So he still believed that lie. Eleanor took a sip of coffee, considering how to proceed. Confronting him directly with everything she had discovered could make him completely shut down. Andrew, if you're having financial difficulties, I can help you. Just me. He finally looked at her directly. What does that mean? It means I worry about you and want to ensure you're okay, but I have conditions for that help. What conditions? His voice tightened. I want you to review your bank accounts. All of them. Your savings, your retirement, your credit card statements. Andrew frowned. Why is that? Because I have reason to believe you're unaware of your true financial situation. What are you talking about? Andrew set his cup down with excessive force, spilling coffee on the table. This isn't some attempt to turn me against Sarah. It's not an attempt, Eleanor interrupted gently. It's a request based on facts I've discovered. Andrew, when was the last time you checked your 401k fund? His expression changed subtly. A flicker of doubt crossed his face. I don't know. A few months ago, maybe. I set everything up for automatic deposits. And the withdrawals, did you authorize any withdrawals recently? He went completely still. What withdrawals? Eleanor opened her purse and took out a sheet of paper, a statement from his retirement fund that Rick had obtained. She placed it on the table, turned toward him. The document clearly showed 3 large withdrawals in the last 2 months. Andrew took the paper with trembling hands, his face losing color as he read. This isn't possible. I never authorized this. There's more, Eleanor said gently, extracting other documents from her purse. Credit card statements in his name with purchases he clearly hadn't made, including expensive jewelry and transfers to accounts they didn't recognize. Andrew scanned the papers, his breathing becoming increasingly rapid. How did you get all this? I hired a private investigator. After Sarah assaulted me, I realized something was very wrong. You investigated my wife. His voice rose an octave indignant. I investigated to protect you, Eleanor replied firmly. And it seems I was right to worry. Andrew Sarah was fired 3 months ago. You have 5 credit cards, maxed out 2 of them in your name. She withdrew $40,000 from your retirement without your authorization. This is a crime. Andrew closed his eyes, taking several deep breaths. When he opened them, there was a mix of emotions in his gaze, anger, confusion, fear, and finally a flash of recognition. The bills. She always said she was paying the bills, but there was always money missing. I thought it was because my salary is low that we weren't managing well. She's stealing from you, son. Andrew shook his head slowly. No, there must be an explanation. Maybe she was desperate after losing her job. Maybe she didn't want to worry me. She must have planned to pay it back when she got a new job. Andrew, Eleanor said with all the gentleness she could muster. There's something else you need to see. She handed him the last document, screenshots of Sarah's conversations with friends where she discussed inheriting a house soon when the old lady bites the dust, and putting up with the old lady for a few more months until we resolve our financial situation. Andrew read the messages once, twice, 3 times, as if he couldn't comprehend the words before him. Then something in his face crumbled. A tear rolled down his cheek, followed by another and another. She always said you didn't accept us because you were too traditional. That's why you treated us with such coldness. Andrew, I never cared who you chose to love. I care about how that person treats you. He wiped his tears with a napkin. When we moved into your house, she said it would be temporary just until we saved money for our own place. But something always came up, an unexpected bill and emergency. She said we were saving, but I never saw the money grow. Eleanor reached across the table to take his hand, and her fingers brushed against the collar of his turtleneck. It's too hot to wear this today. Andrew paled and instinctively pulled the collar higher. It's nothing. Is it her? Has she also been violent with you? His eyes filled with tears again. Slowly he pulled the collar down, revealing finger-shaped marks on his neck, yellowish bruises that appeared to be fading. It was after the hearing, he whispered. She was furious about the restraining order. She said I should have testified in her favor, that I chose you over her. Andrew looked down at the table. "I'm so scared, Mom." The anger Eleanor felt in that moment was different from the cold indignation she had experienced when Sarah threw the glass at her. It was a protective, primal fury, but she couldn't let it control her. Andrew needed clarity, not more emotional chaos. "I want you to come home with me today," she said firmly. "Right now, Sarah can't approach the house because of the restraining order. You'll be safe there. As for your things, we'll send someone to get them later. The important thing is to get you out of that situation immediately. She's going to go crazy when she finds out I left." "That's exactly why you need to leave, Andrew. This is a classic pattern of abuse." Andrew remained silent for a long moment, looking at the documents scattered before them, irrefutable proof of Sarah's financial and emotional betrayal. Finally, he nodded slightly. "Okay, let's go home." On the drive back, Andrew remained silent, staring out the window. Only when Eleanor parked in the garage did he speak again. "How did I let this happen? How did I not realize—" "Abuse rarely starts obviously," Eleanor replied, turning off the engine. "It begins with small lies, small controls that gradually escalate. By the time you realize it, you're already caught in a web." They walked into the house that had always been Andrew's too, the house where he had grown up. Andrew stopped in the middle of the living room, looking around as if seeing the place for the first time. "I'm going to prepare your room," Eleanor said, heading upstairs. Andrew's room was still as it had always been. Eleanor had preserved it when he left for college and had kept it intact even when he and Sarah moved into the guest room. It was a refuge from the past, a place where he could feel safe again. She changed the sheets, opened the windows to let in fresh air, and placed fresh flowers on the nightstand. Small gestures to tell him he was welcome, that this was his home. When she came downstairs, she found Andrew sitting at the kitchen table staring at his cell phone. He looked up when she entered. "She's called 12 times, sent 20 texts asking where I am." "You don't need to answer right now." "I need to. If I don't, she'll show up here restraining order or not." Andrew typed a brief message. "I need some time to think. I'm safe. Please don't look for me today." Seconds later, the phone began ringing. Sarah's name flashed on the screen. Andrew rejected the call with trembling hands and turned off the device. "What do I do now?" he asked, looking lost. "One step at a time," Eleanor replied, sitting beside him. "First, we need to protect your finances. Tomorrow, we'll change your bank passwords and notify the bank about the unauthorized transactions. Then we'll see a lawyer to discuss your legal options." "Legal options," he repeated as if tasting the words. "You mean divorce, among other things. What she did, the unauthorized withdrawals, the credit cards in your name, these are financial crimes, Andrew. You can choose whether or not to file a complaint, but we need to stop her from continuing." Andrew nodded slowly. "I never thought I'd be in this situation. I always thought I'd recognize abuse if it happened to me." "No one thinks it will happen to them," Eleanor said softly. "That's why abuse persists. It's disguised. It's justified. It makes the victim doubt themselves." That night, Eleanor prepared dinner while Andrew took a long bath. They had a simple meal, silent most of the time, but it was a different silence from the one that had existed between them in previous weeks. It wasn't a silence of anger or resentment, but of reflection, of reconnection. Before going to sleep, Andrew hugged Eleanor, the first hug in weeks. "Thank you for not giving up on me," he whispered. "I would never give up," she replied, holding him a little tighter. That night, lying in her bed, Eleanor heard Andrew crying in the next room. The sound broke her heart, but it also brought a strange relief. He was home. He was safe. And the crying was part of the healing process. The next day, as planned, they went to the bank. Andrew canceled all his cards, changed passwords, blocked access. They initiated the process of disputing the unauthorized withdrawals from his retirement account. The manager, seeing the documents and hearing the explanation, strongly suggested that Andrew file a formal complaint for fraud. "We'll think about it." That was all he could manage to respond at the moment. In the afternoon, they met with Rebecca Chen, an attorney specializing in family law and domestic abuse cases. Rebecca was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a firm presence, exactly the kind of person they needed. "Based on what you've told me and the documents you've brought, we have a solid case for divorce on the grounds of improper marital conduct," Rebecca explained. "The financial abuse is well documented, and with the evidence of physical abuse, we can request a permanent protective order, not just the temporary one that already exists." Andrew took a deep breath. What if I don't want her to go to jail? I understand your hesitation, Rebecca replied gently. Many victims of domestic abuse have conflicting feelings about criminally prosecuting their abusers. We can initially focus on the divorce and protecting your assets. Criminal complaints can be a separate decision you make when you're ready. Leaving the office, Andrew seemed simultaneously exhausted and relieved. It feels like I'm waking up from a nightmare, he commented as they drove home. It's a process, Eleanor replied. It's not going to be solved overnight. I know, but now at least I'm walking in the right direction. That night was interrupted by noise at the front door around 10:00 p.m., furious banging the doorbell ringing repeatedly. Andrew and Eleanor looked at each other on the sofa where they were watching a movie. It's her, Andrew whispered, fear evident in his voice. She can't get in, Eleanor assured him, grabbing the phone. And she's violating the restraining order. I'm calling the police. The banging continued, growing louder as Eleanor reported the situation to the 911 operator. My daughter-in-law is violating a restraining order, trying to force her way into my house. We need a patrol car immediately. Andrew, Sarah's voice penetrated through the door. I know you're in there. Open this door right now. Andrew shrank on the sofa, trembling. Eleanor went to him and held his hands. It's okay. She can't get in. The police are on their way. Sarah continued yelling alternately, threatening and pleading. The noise attracted the neighbors' attention. Eleanor saw lights turning on in nearby houses, faces appearing at windows. When the patrol car arrived 7 minutes later, Sarah was still on the porch, now kicking the door. The police found her in flagrant violation of the restraining order. Eleanor and Andrew watched through the window as they arrested her. She continued looking at the house, screaming Andrew's name even as they put her in the patrol car. What's going to happen to her now? Andrew asked, his voice almost inaudible. She'll be arrested for violating the restraining order, Eleanor replied. This has serious consequences. That night, Andrew slept in Eleanor's room as he had done when he was little and had nightmares. But this time the nightmare was outside, being taken away in a police car. The next morning, Eleanor received a call from the detective in charge of Sarah's restraining order violation. The early morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows as she listened to the officer's measured voice. Mrs. Reynolds, Sarah Miller, will remain in custody until the bail hearing scheduled for tomorrow. Given her recent history of violence and last night's clear demonstration of instability, it's likely the judge will set strict conditions for provisional release, possibly including electronic monitoring and supervision requirements. Eleanor thanked him for the information, feeling a complex mixture of relief and concern as she hung up. Andrew was still sleeping upstairs, the events of the previous night having thoroughly exhausted him. She prepared breakfast and left a note explaining where he could find her. She had a scheduled meeting with Rick that couldn't wait. The drive to Rick's small downtown office gave Eleanor time to process the whirlwind of events. In just 2 weeks, her orderly retirement had transformed into a legal battleground with her son caught in the crossfire. The Miami streets passed in a blur as she navigated through morning traffic, her mind occupied with strategies and next steps rather than the palm trees and Art Deco buildings that had once brought her such pleasure. Rick looked concerned when he greeted her at his office door. The room was spartanly furnished but impeccably organized, much like the man himself. Ellie, we've uncovered more about Sarah, things you need to see immediately. He opened a folder and spread documents across his desk. Police records from 2 different cities, both involving Sarah in cases of domestic violence and financial fraud. She's done this before, Rick explained, pointing to the reports. Atlanta 5 years ago and Dallas 3 years ago. In both cases, she targeted financially stable individuals, moved into their homes, manipulated their finances, and eventually became violent when confronted. Eleanor examined the documents, her judicial training allowing her to quickly grasp the patterns. What happened in those previous cases? Rick's expression darkened. In Atlanta, the victim withdrew the complaints after Sarah made promises to change. In Dallas, there was an out-of-court settlement. The victim paid a significant amount to get Sarah out of his life. She's a serial predator, Eleanor murmured, scanning the documents. And Andrew was just her latest target. Exactly. And there's something else. Rick hesitated, carefully selecting his words. We found evidence that Sarah recently researched life insurance and inheritance laws, specifically how to guarantee inheritance rights through marriage in the state of Florida. A cold sensation spread through Eleanor's chest. The implications were unmistakable and terrifying. "Do you think she—" "I can't say for certain she was planning something specific," Rick interjected. "But the pattern is disturbing. She drained Andrew's financial resources. She knew you have a valuable house and other assets. The searches about inheritance combined with those comments about the old lady biting the dust paint a troubling picture." Eleanor left Rick's office with the folder of documents heavy in her hands and an even heavier worry in her heart. What had begun as an assault case at her dining room table had metamorphosed into something far more sinister. A calculated scheme that potentially threatened not just Andrew's financial security, but possibly Eleanor's life. When she arrived home, Eleanor found Andrew in the kitchen preparing lunch, a simple pasta dish. There was a new energy about him, still fragile, but determined. "Where were you?" He stirred the boiling water with more force than necessary. "Meeting with my investigator friend." Eleanor placed the folder on the table. "Andrew, we need to talk. Please sit down." His eyes flicked to the folder, then back to her face. He turned off the stove and sank into a chair. Eleanor carefully explained what Rick had discovered about Sarah's pattern of behavior in previous relationships. Andrew listened in silence, his expression cycling through shock, pain, rage, and finally a resigned acceptance. "So I wasn't special," he finally said, his voice barely audible. "I was simply convenient." "You were a target," Eleanor corrected softly. "But that doesn't diminish who you are. Predators like Sarah are skilled at identifying good, trustworthy people and manipulating them." Andrew ran his hand over his face, taking a deep breath that seemed to draw from the depths of his being. "What do we do now?" "We need to talk to the lawyer and the police. These new documents strengthen both the divorce case and the potential criminal proceedings." Eleanor paused, weighing her next words. "And Sarah's bail hearing is tomorrow." "I don't have to attend, right?" Andrew's hands trembled slightly. "No, but I think I should. I want to make sure the judge understands the full context." "I want to go too." Determination hardened in Andrew's voice. "I need to see her knowing what I know now." The resolution in Andrew's tone surprised Eleanor. In just a few days, he had begun the transformation from confused victim to resolved survivor. That afternoon, they worked out a detailed plan. Andrew filed a petition for contested divorce citing financial and physical abuse, accompanied by all the documents they had collected. Then they filed formal complaints for the financial crimes, unauthorized use of the retirement account, and fraudulent credit card applications. Rebecca accompanied them every step of the way, ensuring all documents were impeccably prepared. "We want to create a case so solid that there's no room for escape," she explained as they left the courthouse. "The combination of civil and criminal proceedings creates immense pressure." That evening, Eleanor found Andrew in his old room, sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at his wedding ring. The gold band caught the last rays of sunset streaming through the window. "I keep thinking about the day she proposed," he said without looking up. "We were at Biscayne Bay watching the sunset. She had arranged a photographer to capture the moment. Everything was perfect. Too perfect, I see now. Orchestrated for maximum effect." Eleanor sat beside him, careful to give him space. Manipulators excel at creating magical moments. They understand the power of grand gestures. "That's the thing about beauty that's only on the surface." Andrew slipped the ring off his finger. "It doesn't need to withstand scrutiny because it's not meant to last." He placed the ring in the drawer of his nightstand and closed it with a finality that spoke volumes. The next morning they prepared for Sarah's bail hearing. Andrew chose a subdued outfit, charcoal slacks and a navy button-down shirt that Eleanor recognized from his graduate school graduation. She opted for one of her former courtroom suites, a subtle reminder to the court of her judicial background. The courthouse was relatively empty when they arrived, accompanied by Rebecca. They were directed to the appropriate courtroom and took discreet seats in the back. Andrew held Eleanor's hand tightly, his fingers cold despite the warmth of the summer day. When Sarah was brought in wearing the orange jail uniform and handcuffs, Andrew's sharp intake of breath was audible. It was the first time he had seen her since the night of the trespassing incident. Sarah scanned the room and her eyes fixed on them. For a moment, her expression softened when she saw Andrew, but then she noticed their intertwined hands and her face contorted with rage. She whispered something to her lawyer, who glanced in their direction and shook his head. Judge Martinez entered and the hearing began. The prosecutor presented the case, emphasizing the flagrant violation of the restraining order and Sarah's recent history of violence. Furthermore, Your Honor, he added, we have information that the defendant has a similar behavioral pattern in other jurisdictions, having been involved in previous cases of domestic violence and fraud in Atlanta and Dallas. This was evidently new information to Sarah. She turned sharply toward her lawyer, visibly shocked. She hadn't expected her past to catch up with her so quickly. The public defender attempted to argue that Sarah had ties to the community, posed no real flight risk, and could await trial outside of custody with appropriate supervision. Judge Martinez listened to the arguments with an impassive expression before delivering her decision. Considering the seriousness of the violation, the defendant's history, and the evident risk to the victims, I determine that the defendant shall remain in custody until trial, with the possibility of review in 30 days upon presentation of an adequate supervision plan. Sarah made a sound of protest, quickly silenced by her lawyer. As the officers approached to escort her back to detention, she turned and looked directly at Andrew. Please, her voice cracked with desperation. Drew, don't let this happen. I love you. We can fix this. Andrew didn't look away. He stood firm, meeting the gaze of the woman who had betrayed and abused him for months. He said nothing, simply watching as Sarah was led out of the courtroom. It was the closure he needed. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, just the silent acknowledgement that this chapter was ending. In the hallway after the hearing, Andrew finally released Eleanor's hand and took a deep breath. I thought it would be harder, he admitted, seeing her like that, hearing her beg. But I could only think of everything we discovered, the other victims, the lies, the inheritance searches. You're incredibly strong, Eleanor said, feeling immense pride in her son. I don't feel strong, he replied honestly. I feel stupid for having fallen for all this, for not having seen the signs. You're not stupid. You were manipulated by someone who turned manipulation into an art form. On the drive home, Andrew was quiet, processing the morning's events. As they approached Eleanor's neighborhood, he suddenly spoke. I think I want to repaint my room. Eleanor glanced at him, surprised by the non sequitur. Your room? Yeah, a fresh color, a symbolic new beginning. He gazed out the window. Maybe blue, a soft blue like the sky after a storm passes. They stopped at a hardware store on the way home and bought paint supplies. The project became a therapeutic routine over the following days. Between meetings with lawyers and banks to resolve Andrew's financial issues, they painted his room, rearranged furniture, and renewed the space that had been his in childhood and adolescence, and would now serve as his sanctuary for healing. 2 weeks after the bail hearing, Andrew received a surprising message from a former colleague at the veterinary clinic. His boss had learned of his situation and was offering him his old job back, but with increased hours and better benefits. Andrew had resigned 6 months earlier when he and Sarah moved into Eleanor's house, another decision he now realized that Sarah had pushed for to isolate him further. I'd like to take it, Andrew told Eleanor over dinner. Getting back to work, helping animals again, it would be good for me. I think that's an excellent idea, Eleanor agreed. Routine and purpose are powerful healers. Andrew started the following Monday, throwing himself into the familiar rhythm of the clinic. Caring for animals had always centered him, and the structure of daily work provided an anchor during the turbulent legal proceedings that continued to unfold. One evening, as Andrew returned from work, Eleanor noticed him lingering by the mantelpiece, examining the family photos displayed there. His attention fixed on one particular image, Andrew at age 7 with his father both smiling on a fishing trip. He wasn't always awful to me, Andrew said softly, picking up the frame. There were good days, too. That's what made it so confusing when he would suddenly turn cruel, telling me I wasn't man enough, that I was too sensitive, too weak. Eleanor moved beside him, seeing the photo with new eyes. Your father had his own demons. That doesn't excuse how he treated you, but it might explain why you became vulnerable to someone like Sarah. Andrew nodded slowly. Dr. Winters says the same thing, that I've been searching for approval from people who withhold it just to recreate the dynamic I had with Dad, trying to finally win the love that was always conditional. Dr. Winters was the therapist Andrew had started seeing twice weekly, a specialist in trauma and abuse recovery. The sessions had become a cornerstone of his healing process. When Sarah first met me, Andrew continued, placing the photo back on the mantel. She seemed to accept everything about me, my interests, my sensitivity, my career choice. After we married, the criticism started slowly. You should be more assertive at work. Why do you let people walk all over you? A real man wouldn't tolerate that. She became the voice of my father, but I couldn't see it. Eleanor hesitated, then shared something she'd never told him. Your father spoke to me that way too before I finally left him. It took me years to recognize it as abuse. Andrew looked at her with surprise. You never told me the details of why you left. I wanted to protect you from the truth. Maybe that was a mistake. Eleanor touched his arm gently. We're more alike than you realize, Andrew. The difference is you're confronting this at 38. I was 45 before I found the courage to leave. Maybe strength runs in the family after all, Andrew said, the ghost of a smile crossing his features. Just not in the way Dad defined it. The next day, Rick called with new information. Eleanor took the call in her office, closing the door for privacy. I've been digging deeper into Sarah's background. Rick's voice was tight with urgency. Ellie, we found evidence potentially linking her to an unsolved case in Florida. A wealthy elderly man, who recently changed his will to favor a young woman matching Sarah's description, was found dead at the bottom of a staircase in his Palm Beach home last year. Eleanor's blood ran cold. Are you saying she might be involved in... I'm not making accusations, Rick cautioned, but I've contacted the detective handling the case. They're very interested in Sarah's pattern of targeting wealthy individuals and her current legal troubles. Does Andrew need to know this? Eleanor questioned, her mind racing through the potential implications. Not yet, Rick advised. Let's wait until the police have investigated further. He's making progress. This might set him back. Eleanor agreed reluctantly, feeling the weight of another secret she would need to keep temporarily from her son. That evening, she found herself checking the locks twice, peering out windows, jumping at unexpected sounds. The possibility that Sarah might be capable of murder cast a darker shadow over everything that had already occurred. A month passed. Life settled into a new routine. Andrew worked at the clinic during the day and attended therapy sessions twice a week. Eleanor returned to some of her retirement activities, her book club volunteer work at the legal aid clinic, tending to her garden. The criminal case against Sarah progressed slowly, grinding through the judicial system Eleanor knew all too well. Sarah remained in custody, having been denied a second request for provisional release when new evidence of her previous activities came to light. Andrew had started therapy twice a week, working to understand what had made him vulnerable to abuse and how to build healthier relationships in the future. Some nights Eleanor heard him crying in his room, but the episodes became less frequent, less intense. The healing wasn't linear, but it was happening. The newly painted blue walls of his room seemed to provide a peaceful container for his grief and recovery. One Saturday afternoon, as they prepared lunch together, an activity that had become a comforting ritual, the phone rang. It was Rebecca Chen. I have news, she announced. Sarah's lawyer contacted me proposing a plea deal. Eleanor put the phone on speaker so Andrew could hear. What kind of deal? She'll plead guilty to the financial crimes and the restraining order violation in exchange for a reduced sentence, 2 years in prison followed by 3 years of supervised probation. She also agrees to a no-contest divorce, waiving any claim to Andrew's assets or Eleanor's future inheritance. Andrew looked at Eleanor, his eyes wide with surprise and uncertainty. What do you think? Eleanor weighed her words carefully. It's your decision, Andrew. But 2 years in prison plus 3 years of probation is a significant sentence. And most importantly, she would be legally admitting what she did. If we don't accept, Andrew asked Rebecca, what happens next? We go to trial. With the evidence we have, I believe we can secure a harsher conviction, perhaps 4 or 5 years in prison. But trials are unpredictable, and both of you would have to testify, reliving everything in a public forum. Andrew took a deep breath, the kind that seemed to be drawing strength from somewhere deep inside. Can I think about it? Of course, Rebecca replied. They've given us a 3-day deadline to consider the proposal. After they hung up, Andrew silently returned to chopping vegetables for their salad. Eleanor respected his silence, giving him space to process this new development. I don't know if I want to see her in prison for 5 years, he finally said. Not out of misplaced loyalty, but I also don't know if 2 years is enough to feel safe when she gets out. Supervised probation is serious, Eleanor commented. She would have to report regularly, couldn't approach you, would have to participate in rehabilitation programs. Any violation would send her directly back to prison. Andrew nodded, absorbing the information. And the divorce would be faster if she doesn't contest it. Much faster and less emotionally draining for you. He continued chopping tomatoes in silence for several minutes. I'm going to think it over. I want to make the right decision for the right reasons. 2 days later, Andrew asked Eleanor to accompany him to Rebecca's office. His face was serene, the decision made. I want to accept the plea deal, he announced as they settled into Rebecca's comfortable chairs. Not because it's easier, but because it's enough. 2 years in prison, 3 on probation, a clean divorce, and the legal recognition of her guilt. It's justice without being revenge. Rebecca smiled approvingly. I think that's a wise decision, Andrew. I'll communicate it to the prosecutor and her lawyer immediately. The process moved surprisingly quickly after that. A week later, they appeared in court for the hearing where Sarah would formally accept the plea agreement. It was the first time Andrew would see her since the bail hearing a month ago. Sarah seemed to have aged years in just a few weeks. The prison uniform hung loosely on her thinner frame. Her once perfect dyed hair now showed gray roots. When she saw Andrew and Eleanor entering the courtroom, her eyes fixed on Andrew with disturbing intensity. The judge reviewed the terms of the agreement in detail before addressing Sarah. Mrs. Miller, do you understand that by pleading guilty you're admitting to committing the crimes of financial fraud, battery, and violation of a court order? Yes, Your Honor. Sarah's voice sounded rougher than Eleanor remembered. And are you doing so voluntarily, aware of the consequences? Yes, Your Honor. Very well. This court accepts your plea of guilty and sentences you to 2 years of incarceration, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. The specific terms of probation include an absolute prohibition of contact with the victim's mandatory participation in anger management programs and financial restitution, as stipulated in the civil agreement. The judge's gavel sealed Sarah's fate. As officers approached to escort her away, Sarah turned toward Andrew one last time. Drew, she called out, ignoring the guard's warning. I'm sorry for everything. Andrew didn't respond. He simply held her gaze for a few seconds before looking away. It was the closure he needed. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, just the silent acknowledgement that this chapter of his life was ending. In the courthouse hallway, Andrew released a long-held breath. I thought it would be harder, he confessed, seeing her sentenced. You were very brave, Eleanor said, her chest swelling with pride for her son. I don't feel brave, he replied honestly. I feel like I've been sleepwalking for 2 years and just woke up to find myself in a completely different life. On the drive home, Andrew was unusually talkative, as if a dam had broken. You know what Dr. Winters said yesterday, that trauma bonds are like invisible chains. Breaking them isn't just about physical distance, it's about seeing the chains for what they are. He gazed out the window at the Miami skyline. I can see them now. When they arrived home, Andrew announced he wanted to finish painting the trim in his room. Eleanor joined him, and they worked in companionable silence for a while, the rhythmic brush strokes creating a meditative atmosphere. Dr. Winters suggested I join a support group, Andrew said suddenly, for men who've experienced domestic abuse. She says it might help to share with others who understand. What do you think about that idea? Eleanor dipped her brush in the can of glossy white paint. I'm terrified, Andrew admitted, but I'm going to do it anyway. That's what courage is, right? Not the absence of fear, but action despite it. Eleanor smiled at her son, recognizing the resilient spirit that had always been there waiting to emerge from the shadows of manipulation. That's exactly what courage is. 3 months passed. Life took on a new normal. Andrew had returned to working full-time at the veterinary clinic where his colleagues welcomed him back with warmth and discretion. He continued therapy and had joined the support group where he found unexpected connections with other men who shared similar experiences. Eleanor had resumed her volunteer work at the legal aid clinic with renewed purpose, now specializing in helping victims of domestic abuse navigate the complex legal system. Her experience as both a judge and the mother of an abuse survivor gave her unique insight and empathy. One evening, Andrew returned home with surprising news. I've been invited to speak at a state conference on domestic violence, he announced over dinner. They want me to share my experience from the perspective of a male survivor. Eleanor looked up from her plate, surprised. That's a significant honor. How do you feel about it? Terrified, Andrew admitted with a small laugh. Absolutely terrified, but also determined, like this might be a way to give meaning to everything that happened. As the conference date approached, Andrew's anxiety grew. He paced the living room rehearsing his presentation while Eleanor offered feedback. What if I'm not eloquent enough? He worried, tugging at the collar of his shirt. What if I freeze mid-speech and look like an amateur? Then you take a deep breath, Sip some water and continue, Eleanor replied calmly. Remember, you're not there to impress anyone with your public speaking skills. You're there to share a truth that might help others. The day of the conference arrived. Eleanor sat in the audience watching her son step onto the stage. He wore a simple but elegant blue suit, his hair neatly styled. He looked confident, centered in a way she hadn't seen in years. My name is Andrew Reynolds. He began, his voice steady despite his nerves. And today I'm going to share with you how a broken glass of wine saved my life. For 40 minutes, he held the audience completely engaged, alternating between raw vulnerability when describing his own abuse and precise analysis of how the system often fails to recognize and address financial abuse, particularly when the victims are men. He concluded with a call for more education, better laws, and greater awareness of the warning signs that so often go unrecognized. The most dangerous prison isn't built with bars, he said in closing. It's constructed with doubt, with shame, with the belief that you deserve the cage you're in. Freedom begins not when the door opens, but when you realize there is a door at all. The standing ovation he received when he finished lasted several minutes. Eleanor felt tears in her eyes, not of sadness, but of profound pride. Her son had transformed his pain into purpose, his experience into wisdom. After the talk, as they prepared to leave, Andrew was approached by an elegantly dressed older woman wearing a badge identifying her as a representative of the Meredith Foundation, a well-known philanthropic organization. Mr. Reynolds, your presentation was extraordinary, she said. I'm impressed with the work you're proposing. I'd like to discuss the possibility of funding to expand educational outreach on financial abuse recognition. Andrew looked at Eleanor, his eyes wide with surprise and hope. She nodded encouragingly. That would be wonderful, Andrew replied. I have so many ideas about reaching more people, especially in rural areas where resources are scarce. They exchanged business cards, agreeing to meet the following week. As they walked toward the parking lot, Andrew seemed to be floating with excitement. Can you believe it? He exclaimed. Real funding to develop the project. We could create materials in multiple languages, develop an app for secure financial tracking, maybe even open a small office. You've earned this opportunity, Eleanor said. You've worked incredibly hard to transform your experience into something that will help others. Andrew stopped suddenly in the parking lot and embraced her, a strong hug filled with gratitude. None of this would have happened without you, Mom. Without your strength that night, without your persistence afterward, without your support throughout this whole process. Eleanor returned the embrace, experiencing the peculiar sensation that only mothers know. Pride and nostalgia, simultaneously seeing your child grow beyond what you could have imagined. You always had that strength inside you, Andrew. You just needed to rediscover it. They drove to a celebratory dinner at Eleanor's favorite restaurant overlooking Biscayne Bay. As they waited for their food, Andrew raised his water glass in a toast. To broken glass, he said with a smile that reached his eyes, and the clarity that sometimes comes after. Eleanor clinked her glass against his. To seeing clearly at last. The sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, reflecting on the water as they shared a meal and made plans for the future. Not plans built on illusion or manipulation, but on the solid foundation of truth and healing they had painstakingly constructed together. 3 months after Sarah's sentencing, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table reviewing the financial statements Andrew had received from his retirement fund administrator. The company had completed their investigation and agreed to restore the full amount Sarah had withdrawn, citing clear evidence of fraud. The morning sunlight spilled across the documents as Eleanor made notes in her precise handwriting, another small victory in their ongoing recovery process. The sound of Andrew's car pulling into the driveway broke her concentration. He entered the kitchen with unusual energy, his face animated in a way Eleanor hadn't seen in years. We got the grant? His voice echoed through the kitchen as he placed a leather portfolio on the table. The Meredith Foundation approved the full proposal, $200,000 for the first year of Safe New Beginnings. Eleanor rose to embrace him, feeling the vibration of excitement in his body. Andrew, that's wonderful news. It's more than just money. He pulled away, opening the portfolio to reveal the official letter. They're offering office space in their downtown building, administrative support, and connections to other organizations working in the domestic violence space. The transformation in Andrew over the past 6 months had been remarkable. From the broken man who had pulled down his turtleneck to reveal bruises, he had evolved into someone with purpose and direction. The therapy sessions with Dr. Winters, the support group, and now this new professional focus had combined to forge a stronger version of the son Eleanor had always known was there. "I need to start putting together a team," Andrew continued, pacing the kitchen. "We'll need a website developer, educational content creators, someone with experience in financial abuse specifically. And I want to reach out to law enforcement training programs. Officers need to recognize the signs better than they currently do." Eleanor watched him with quiet pride. "When do you start, Bo?" "Officially next month. But I've already submitted my notice at the clinic." Andrew paused, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. "I hope that wasn't premature." "It was brave," Eleanor corrected. "Taking a leap toward something meaningful always is." The following weeks passed in a flurry of activity. Andrew transformed Eleanor's dining room into a temporary office space, the table covered with laptops, grant documents, and organizational charts. Eleanor found herself drafted as an unofficial advisor, her judicial experience proving valuable as Andrew navigated the legal aspects of establishing a nonprofit. One evening, as they sorted through potential office furniture options, Andrew's phone rang. The caller ID showed Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office. Eleanor felt a chill as Andrew answered, putting the call on speaker. "Mr. Reynolds, this is Detective Ramirez with Major Crimes. I'm calling regarding Sarah Miller." Andrew's hand trembled slightly. "Has something happened?" "No, sir, but we'd like to speak with you regarding an open investigation that may involve Ms. Miller. Would you be available to meet tomorrow morning?" After arranging the meeting, Andrew looked at Eleanor with concern etching his features. "What do you think this is about?" Eleanor hesitated, debating whether to share her suspicions. Rick had kept her informed about the Palm Beach investigation, but she had protected Andrew from this additional worry while he focused on healing. "It might be related to some information Rick uncovered," she finally admitted. "There's an unsolved case in Palm Beach that may have connections to Sarah." Andrew's expression hardened. "What kind of case?" "A suspicious death. An elderly man who changed his will shortly before he died in what was initially ruled an accident." "You've known about this?" A flash of hurt crossed Andrew's face. "For how long?" "Rick told me 3 months ago. I didn't want to burden you with it until we knew more." Eleanor reached for his hand. "You were making such progress." Andrew withdrew his hand, struggling with this new information. "I thought we were done with secrets, Mom. I thought we were beyond protecting each other from the truth." "I'm sorry," Eleanor said softly. "You're right. I should have told you." Andrew's anger dissipated quickly, replaced by something more complex. "It's just, I keep thinking I've uncovered the full extent of who she was, and then another layer appears." He rubbed his temples. "What if there's no bottom to this? What if I never know the complete truth about the person I married?" "Sometimes closure doesn't come from having all the answers," Eleanor offered. "It comes from being able to live with the questions." The next morning, they drove to the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office in silence, each lost in private thoughts. Detective Ramirez, a serious woman with shrewd eyes and salt and pepper hair, led them to a conference room where a case file lay open. "Thank you for coming." She began sliding photographs across the table. "This is Harold Whitmore, 72, found dead at the bottom of his staircase last January in his Palm Beach mansion. The initial ruling was accidental death, but certain inconsistencies prompted us to keep the case open." Andrew examined the photo of a distinguished-looking elderly man. "What does this have to do with Sarah?" 3 months before his death, Mr. Whitmore changed his will to include a substantial bequest to a woman he had recently been dating, a woman named Natalie Chambers. Detective Ramirez placed another photo on the table, a driver's license photo of Sarah, but with different hair, and the name Natalie Chambers. "This is one of several aliases we've connected to Sarah Miller. We believe she was involved with Mr. Whitmore during the time his will was changed, then disappeared shortly after his death before the new will could be executed." Andrew stared at the unfamiliar image of his wife. "She was using a different name when we met. She told me she had changed it after a divorce to make a fresh start." "That was part of her pattern," Ramirez explained. "New name, new city, new target." She turned to Eleanor. "Your investigator, Mr. Davis, brought this connection to our attention. The evidence is circumstantial but compelling." For the next hour, they answered questions about Sarah's behavior, finances, and movements during their marriage. As they prepared to leave, Detective Ramirez offered a final observation. "Mr. Reynolds, we see this more often than you might think. Intelligent, capable people targeted by sophisticated predators." The fact that you recognized the situation and took action speaks to your strength, not your weakness. The drive back to Miami was quiet until Andrew broke the silence. I've been thinking about what you said last night, about living with the questions. Maybe that's the real challenge after trauma, learning to move forward without perfect closure. It's one of life's hardest lessons, Eleanor agreed, accepting that some stories in our lives will never have satisfying endings. Andrew stared out the window at the Florida landscape rushing past. The thing is, I don't think I need to know everything anymore. I know enough about who she was. What matters more is who I'm becoming. The following week, Andrew moved out of Eleanor's house and into an apartment closer to his new office. The decision came suddenly but felt right to both of them. Eleanor helped him pack, carefully wrapping the few mementos he wanted to take from his childhood room. "You know you're always welcome here," she reminded him as they loaded the last box into his car. "I know." Andrew surveyed the house where he had sought refuge in his darkest moment. "But I think we both need this next step. You need your space back, and I need to stand on my own." "Are you sure you're ready?" Eleanor couldn't help the maternal concern that crept into her voice. Andrew smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes. "No, but I'm going to do it anyway." His new apartment was small but modern, located in a secure building with a doorman, a precaution that brought Eleanor peace of mind, especially with Sarah's eventual release, still a worry that lingered at the edges of their conversations. Andrew furnished it minimally but thoughtfully, creating a space that reflected his emerging sense of self rather than the remnants of his past. Eleanor found herself adjusting to an empty house again, rediscovering the rhythms of solitude. She joined a book club, resumed her volunteer work at the legal aid clinic, and even accepted an invitation to lecture occasionally at the law school. Life settled into a new pattern, different from before, but satisfying in its own way. Andrew threw himself into building safe new beginnings. The organization grew quickly, attracting attention from media and other advocacy groups. 6 months after receiving the initial grant, he had assembled a small team of dedicated professionals and established partnerships with financial institutions to develop programs specifically focused on preventing and detecting financial abuse. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, Eleanor received an unexpected call from Rebecca Chen. "Eleanor, I wanted to give you a heads up. Sarah has filed a petition for early release based on exemplary behavior and completion of multiple rehabilitation programs. The hearing is scheduled for next week." Eleanor's grip tightened on the phone. "Is there a chance it could be granted?" "It's possible. She served 8 months of a 2-year sentence. With prison overcrowding and her participation in every available program, the board might consider it." Rebecca paused. Andrew should be prepared for the possibility. After thanking Rebecca, Eleanor debated how to share this news with Andrew. He had been doing so well establishing a new life and identity separate from his traumatic past. The possibility of Sarah's early release threatened to disrupt the stability he had worked so hard to achieve. She decided to tell him in person. That evening, she drove to his office, finding him still working despite the late hour. The space was impressive, open and modern, with educational materials and resource guides lining the walls. A small team occupied desks in the main area, while Andrew had a glass-walled office at the end. He greeted her with surprise and ushered her inside, clearing a chair of file folders. "Mom, what brings you here? Is everything okay?" Eleanor delivered the news as gently as possible. Andrew listened without interruption, his expression shifting from shock to concern to something more resolute. "I knew this was a possibility," he finally said. 2 years was always the maximum, not a guarantee. "How do you feel about it?" Eleanor watched him carefully. Andrew considered the question, his response measured. 6 months ago, I would have been terrified. Now I'm concerned but not paralyzed. The restraining order is still in effect. She can't approach either of us. "Do you want to attend the hearing?" Eleanor asked. "No." His answer came quickly. "I've said what I needed to say. My presence won't change the outcome, and I don't want to give her the satisfaction of seeing me still affected by her." Eleanor nodded, respecting his decision. "I think that's wise." As they left the office together, Andrew paused to lock up, then turned to Eleanor with a determined expression. "Whatever happens at that hearing, I refuse to let it derail everything I've built. She's taken enough from my life already." The parole hearing proceeded without them. Rebecca attended as an observer and called immediately afterward. "The board granted conditional early release," she reported. Sarah will be released next month with strict supervision requirements, regular check-ins with a parole officer, continued therapy, no contact with either of you, electronic monitoring, and restrictions on her movement. Despite the stringent conditions, the news sent a ripple of unease through Eleanor. That night, she double-checked all the locks in her house before going to bed, a habit she thought she had overcome. Dreams of shattered crystal and Sarah's rage-contorted face disturbed her sleep. Andrew took the news with surprising calm when Eleanor called to inform him. "We knew this might happen," he said pragmatically. "Nothing changes in our lives. She's still legally barred from contacting us." "Just be vigilant," Eleanor cautioned, unable to shake her concern. "Always," Andrew assured her. "But I won't live in fear either." In the weeks that followed, both Eleanor and Andrew found themselves instinctively more alert, checking rearview mirrors more frequently, scanning restaurant patrons when dining out, startling at unexpected knocks. But as days passed without incident, the hypervigilance gradually subsided. 2 months after Sarah's release, Andrew was featured in a national magazine article about male survivors of domestic abuse. The piece was thoughtful and comprehensive, highlighting the unique challenges men face in reporting abuse and seeking help. Andrew's organization was showcased as a model program for addressing financial abuse across gender lines. The publicity generated a surge of donations, and more importantly to Andrew, calls from men seeking help. Safe New Beginnings expanded rapidly, adding support groups and a hotline staffed by trained counselors. Andrew hired 2 additional full-time employees and moved to a larger office space to accommodate the growth. One evening, as Eleanor was preparing for bed, her doorbell rang. Cautious after months of heightened alertness, she checked the security camera she had installed after Sarah's assault. Andrew stood on her porch, shoulders hunched against a sudden summer thunderstorm. She opened the door quickly. "Andrew, is everything all right?" "Everything's fine," he reassured her, stepping inside and shaking rain from his jacket. "I was driving home from a late meeting and realized I wanted to talk to you." They settled in the living room with mugs of herbal tea, the storm raging outside providing a dramatic backdrop to their conversation. Andrew seemed contemplative, weighing his words carefully. "I met someone," he finally said, studying the steam rising from his mug. "Her name is Melissa. She's a financial crimes investigator with the state attorney's office. We've been consulting with her office on some of our educational materials." Eleanor felt a flutter of both hope and concern. "How long have you been seeing each other?" "We're not dating exactly, just talking, getting to know each other." Andrew set his mug down. "That's actually what I wanted to discuss with you. Dr. Winters thinks I should consider dating again, says it's part of reclaiming my life. But I'm terrified, Mom. What if my judgment is permanently broken?" "Your judgment wasn't broken," Eleanor corrected gently. "You were targeted by someone who specialized in manipulation. It wasn't random bad luck. But how do I trust myself again?" The vulnerability in his question reminded Eleanor of Andrew as a child seeking reassurance after a nightmare. "The fact that you're asking that question shows you've already changed," she pointed out. "You're aware in a way you weren't before, and you've built an entire organization around recognizing the warning signs." Andrew considered this rain drumming against the windows, filling the silence between them. "There's something else," he admitted. "Melissa knows everything. About Sarah, the abuse, the financial fraud, all of it. I told her on our 3rd lunch meeting, thinking it would scare her away. And it didn't. No. She said it showed resilience, that surviving something like that and transforming it into help for others demonstrated character." A small smile played at the corner of his mouth. "Then she showed me her background check on me that she'd run before our first meeting." Eleanor laughed, surprised. "She investigated you, professional habit," she said. Andrew's smile widened. "I think I might actually like someone who approaches relationships with thorough due diligence." The storm outside began to subside, distant thunder replacing the earlier crashes that had shaken the windows. Andrew rose to leave, pausing at the door. "I didn't expect to be considering dating again so soon," he confessed. "Is it crazy to even think about it?" "It's not crazy," Eleanor assured him. "It's brave. And if this Melissa has already done her homework on you and still wants to know you better, she sounds like someone worth knowing." Over the next several months, Andrew's friendship with Melissa evolved gradually into something more intentional. He approached the relationship with caution and transparency, sharing his concerns and boundaries openly. Melissa, with her investigator's attention to detail and direct communication style, proved to be exactly the partner Andrew needed as he navigated this new territory. Eleanor met her at a small dinner Andrew hosted at his apartment. Melissa was not what Eleanor had expected. Shorter than Andrew, with curly hair cut practically short and a no-nonsense demeanor that initially seemed severe. But as the evening progressed, Eleanor observed how Melissa's serious exterior softened around Andrew, how she listened attentively when he spoke, and how her analytical mind complemented his empathetic nature. "She's quite different from Sarah," Eleanor commented when Andrew called the next day. "In every conceivable way," he agreed. "She values honesty above charm, substance over appearance. And she's pathologically incapable of manipulation. Her idea of subtlety is saying you might want to consider, instead of you should." Eleanor heard the fondness in his voice, a warmth that had been absent for so long. "You seem happy." "I'm getting there," Andrew acknowledged. "Not because of Melissa, but she's part of it. The whole picture is coming together. The work, the therapy, reconnecting with old friends, making new ones. I'm building a life I actually want, not one I fell into or was manipulated into." Nearly a year after Sarah's sentencing, Detective Ramirez called with news. The Palm Beach County prosecutor had decided to file charges against Sarah for fraud in connection with Harold Whitmore's changed will based on new evidence and her established pattern of behavior. While they didn't have enough evidence for homicide charges, the fraud case was solid. "They'll serve her with the new charges while she's still under supervision," Ramirez explained. "This could add significant time to her sentence, especially given her prior convictions." The news brought complex emotions for both Eleanor and Andrew. On one hand, it meant potential disruption, as they might be called to testify about Sarah's patterns of behavior. On the other, it reinforced that they had been right to take action potentially preventing Sarah from victimizing others. "It's never really over, is it?" Andrew mused when Eleanor relayed the detective's call. "There will always be another hearing, another revelation, another chapter of the Sarah saga." "True," Eleanor acknowledged, "but each time it affects us less. Each time we're stronger and more distant from it." A week later, the annual domestic violence conference, where Andrew had first spoken publicly about his experience, invited him to deliver the keynote address. The event had grown significantly partly due to the attention Andrew's organization had brought to financial abuse as a critical but often overlooked form of domestic violence. Eleanor sat in the front row watching Andrew take the podium with confidence that had been hard-won through months of healing and purpose. Melissa sat beside her, professionally attired, but with a small pin on her lapel bearing the Safe New Beginnings logo, a subtle sign of personal support amidst her professional presence. "A year ago, I stood on this stage and told you how a broken glass saved my life." Andrew began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed auditorium. "Today, I want to talk about what happens after the glass breaks, how we pick up the pieces and create something new from the fragments." He spoke eloquently about the journey from victim to survivor, to advocate about the systemic changes needed to better protect all victims of domestic violence, regardless of gender or type of abuse. He shared statistics and stories gathered through his organization's work, painting a comprehensive picture of both the challenges and the progress being made. "The most insidious aspect of abuse is how it convinces you that you're alone." Andrew continued, his gaze sweeping across the audience. "That your experience is unique, shameful, or somehow your fault. Breaking that isolation is often the first step toward freedom." As he spoke, Eleanor reflected on their journey over the past year. The night of the assault had seemed like an ending, the shattering of family bonds, the loss of her relationship with her son. Instead, it had become a beginning, painful but necessary, leading to authentic connection and growth neither of them could have imagined. After the speech during the reception, Eleanor found herself surrounded by professionals from various agencies, all eager to discuss potential collaborations with Safe New Beginnings. She observed Andrew across the room engaged in animated conversation with a group of legislators interested in strengthening financial abuse provisions in domestic violence laws. Melissa appeared at Eleanor's side, offering a glass of sparkling water. "He's remarkable," she commented, following Eleanor's gaze to Andrew. "Do you know what he told me when we first started dating? That he wasn't sure if he'd ever be whole again after what happened with Sarah." "And now?" Eleanor asked, curious about this glimpse into their private conversations. "Now he says he's not trying to be the person he was before. He's becoming someone new, someone stronger and more authentic." Melissa smiled, a rare, full expression that transformed her serious features. "I never knew the old Andrew, but I'm quite fond of this version." As the event concluded, Andrew joined them, loosening his tie with a relieved sigh. "I think that went well." "It was perfect," Eleanor assured him, embracing her son. "I'm so proud of you." They walked together toward the exit, planning to continue their celebration at a nearby restaurant. As they crossed the lobby, Andrew paused suddenly, his attention caught by a wall of television screens displaying various news channels. On one screen, a breaking news banner scrolled beneath a reporter standing outside a correctional facility. Sarah Miller, convicted of financial fraud and domestic violence last year, was charged today with additional counts of fraud related to the suspicious death of Palm Beach millionaire Harold Whitmore. Miller, who was recently granted early release, has been taken back into custody following these new allegations. Andrew watched the report in silence, his expression unreadable. When the news segment ended, he turned away from the screens. "Are you okay?" Eleanor asked quietly. "Yes," he answered, and the simplicity of his response carried the weight of truth. "That's her story now, not mine." Outside, the Miami evening embraced them with warm, flower-scented air. Stars appeared in the darkening sky above the city's glittering skyline. Andrew offered an arm to each of the women, a gesture both chivalrous and symbolic, moving forward supported and supporting. "You know what Dr. Winters said in our last session?" Andrew looked from Eleanor to Melissa as they walked. "That healing isn't about erasing scars, but about wearing them with the knowledge that they prove our capacity to mend." Eleanor squeezed his arm gently. "I think you've done more than mend, Andrew. You've transformed." Later that night, returning to her quiet house, Eleanor stood for a moment in Andrew's old room. The blue walls remained, though the space was now more of a guest room, its personal touches removed to Andrew's new life. She thought about the journey they had traveled, from the night of shattered crystal to this moment of hard-won peace. Healing wasn't linear, Eleanor reflected as she prepared for bed. It came in waves with setbacks and breakthroughs, moments of doubt and clarity. The past year had taught her that justice and recovery often followed winding paths rather than straight lines. She settled into her reading chair with a cup of chamomile tea, gazing out at the moon-silvered garden. The house was quiet, but it no longer felt empty. It was simply still peaceful in a way that acknowledged rather than denied the storms that had passed through it. Eleanor had spent 30 years of her life serving justice from behind a bench, rendering verdicts, and imposing sentences with careful consideration for both law and humanity. But she had never fully understood justice's deeper purpose until witnessing Andrew's journey. Not merely punishment for wrongs committed, but restoration of what had been damaged, transformation of suffering into strength. The broken glass that had shattered on her dining room floor a year ago had been more than an act of violence. It had been the beginning of a truth that needed to emerge, painful but necessary. From those fragments, something stronger had been forged. A renewed bond between mother and son, a purpose that would help countless others, and the profound knowledge that sometimes we must break completely before we can rebuild ourselves into something better than before.